Are we sitting comfortably? Then we'll begin. In this presentation, we're going to look at how to write a Section 1 essay on our set text wish list. You can pause the video at the end of the commentary on each slide so that you can read the slide or at any point that you feel you want to read what I've spoken about. First of all, we're going to look at the SQA exam paper from 2022 and take the quote, "I don't want to be worrying about this all day," and how this quote can be used to answer all 6 questions of that exam paper. Hopefully you will see what you need to change about an answer to use the quote to answer other questions. Questions 1 or 2 are from the point of view as a director, questions 3 and 4 from the point of view as an actor, and questions 5 to 6 from the point of view as a designer. And this is the normal structure for Section 1. Question 1 is asking about the message of the play and how, as a director, you would make the message clear to the audience. The first part of the A paragraph will be the same for every question, where you describe what is happening when the quote is said. The next part of the paragraph is to explain how this quote answers the question about the message of the play, including the impact on the other characters. You must include the language of the question. It communicates the message. The third part of this paragraph, you have to show the impact on the audience and analyse how it helps to link to the play either the theme, the message, the impact on a character relationships. And that's true for every question for the Part B paragraph. But because this question is about the message of the play, you cannot talk about the message here. So therefore, you really need to talk about the themes so that you don't duplicate yourself. So be careful when answering these questions that you don't duplicate something that you've said earlier. And again, at the end, I've used the language of the question to bring it back to the question where I've said this reinforces the message of the play. So now moving on to the B paragraph, where you have to take on the role as a director and what directing concept you would use to communicate what you've written in the A paragraph. So in the first section, you have to describe what directing concept you're using. So for proxemics that I'm using in this example, remember you have to say whether it is close or distant proxemics that you're using and where the actors are in the acting area. And here I'm saying they are downstage right or DSR. For the second part of this paragraph, you have to explain how this will communicate the message of the play, and again, using the language of the question, communicating the message that the establishment doesn't take into account the needs of the individual. And for the last part of your answer, the analysis, you have to analyse what will the impact on the audience be, and how does it link to either the social conditions or foreshadow what's to come, bringing it back to the language of the question, which I've said reinforces the message of the play. Now, again, be careful here. I would usually link it to the social conditions unless it's a sort of social question, and then you would have to link it to foreshadowing what's to come. Question 2 is a directing question and is asking about the qualities and or characteristics of a character, and the B paragraph is about directing concepts. The first section, describing what's happening, is exactly the same as the previous question. In the second part, state what quality this shows and then explain how it shows Tamsin as a caregiver. Make sure that you use the language of the question. I've used it twice in this short section. So at the beginning, this shows Tamsin's quality as a caregiver, and then further on, it helps to communicate Tamsin's quality as a caregiver. In the analysis, I have linked it to the theme of family commitment, explaining how it does this, but also bringing it back to the question, using the language of the question, her quality. In paragraph B, in the first part where I'm describing my directing concept, I'm using the same answer as question 1 on proxemics, because it also communicates Tamsin's quality. My explanation is fairly straightforward in stating how it shows her caring quality, again using the language of the question. For my analysis, here I'm writing mostly the same answer as question 1, but making slight changes so that it answers the question, starting with the impact on the audience and then going on to talk about the social conditions and linking it back to the question, highlighting Tamsin's quality as a caregiver since she takes on the responsibility of looking after her brother. Question 3 is an acting question that asks about a breakdown in relationships. What is different about the B section is that it doesn't ask about acting techniques, but rehearsal techniques. I will give you a handout with a list of rehearsal activities on it, but you can also think about some of the activities that we carried out when rehearsing acting pieces either this year or last year for the Nat 5 practical exam. The first part of paragraph A is exactly the same because what is happening when the quote is said hasn't changed. In the second part, explain what is said shows a breakdown in the relationships between Tamsin and Dean and use the language of the question, breakdown in the relationship. The last section is the same as the previous question, linking it to the theme, but this time changing it so that it answers what is asked, which creates tension between them, showing a breakdown in their relationships. Now on to the B paragraph. Firstly, I'm going to describe a rehearsal activity that could be used by the actors at this point. I've chosen the exercise where one character sits on the floor whilst the other walks around them saying the lines in the scene. Another example I could have chosen is the pushing exercise, or maybe even hot seating. Once I've described the activity, I then explain how this activity helps the actors to explore the breakdown in their relationships, remembering to use the language of the question. Lastly, I've expanded on the benefits for the actors and brought it back to the social conditions using the language of the question so that the government doesn't take into account the needs of the people that are struggling, which helps to create the breakdown in their relationship. Question 4 is another acting question, this time asking how a character's status is important to the plot. And the B paragraph asks for an acting concept to communicate what you've written in the A paragraph. For the introduction of paragraph A, the describe what's happening is exactly the same as the previous question. What I think is tricky about this question is that both Dean and Tamsin are low status characters. Even Luke doesn't have a high status. The lead has the highest status of all 4 characters, but he still doesn't have a really high status. So to answer this question, we need to say that Tamsin is a low status character, but she does have a higher status than Dean. But remember that it is not simply a status question. You have to say why this is important to the plot. In the analysis, this is the same as the other question, but this time linking it back to the question, status and plot. For paragraph B, the description of the acting concept is the same as questions 1 and 2. In the explanation, I'm saying the same thing as questions 1 and 2, but saying why it shows her higher status and importance to the plot. And for the analysis, I'm saying the same thing, linking it to the social conditions, but using the language of the question, plot and status. Question 5 is a designer question that asks about a scene that communicates the social context of the play. And for the B paragraph, 5 design aspects that will communicate this. The describing part is once again exactly the same as the other questions. In the explanation section, I need to change what I've said previously so that it explains the social context of the play, and I've used the same thing as the message of the play to do this. In the analysis, this is the same as before, but again changing it so that it brings it back to the question, the social context of the play. In the B paragraph, I have to start by describing an aspect of design to communicate the social context. I've chosen the blue walls and the dampness patch in the upstage right corner. In the explanation of how this answers the question, I've said that it shows their poor living conditions and linking it to the social conditions of the play using the language of the question. For the analysis, it starts the same as the other questions, but this time I cannot link it to the social conditions because that's what the question is about, and I would be in danger of repeating what I've already said. So this time I need to link it to how it foreshadows what's to come and then link it to the social context so that I'm using the language of the question. Question 6, the last question, is another design question. This time we're asked about 5 moments of tension and how 5 design aspects will communicate this tension. Now I think this is quite a difficult question. To start with, it's just the same as the other questions describing what happens when the quote is said. The explanation is very similar to what has been said in the other questions, but saying how it creates tension. So it's really very similar to the question earlier about a breakdown in relationships, but this focus being on tension. The analysis again is very similar to the other question, but this time linking it back to tension using the language of the question. Paragraph B starts with describing a design aspect, and I've used the same as the previous design question, the blue flats and the black mould in the upstage right corner. The explanation is where this question becomes difficult. We can say much the same as before in that it helps communicate their poor living conditions, but we have to link it to how it helps highlight the tension. I've said that it creates a cold and austere atmosphere which highlights the tension between them because of the conditions that they're living in. The analysis, I have said the same as the last design question, but linking it back to the question using the language of the question. I could have gone back to linking it to the social conditions for the play for this question as well, but I've stuck with foreshadowing. Because it can be difficult to think how a design aspect can communicate tension, I'm going to give you some more examples here. Fairly straightforward. There's a new line and cue that we've not spoken about before because I've had to make this up so that I could answer the question. So for moment 5, I'd bring the lighting in the fulfilment centre down, only to have a tight focused lantern on the leading Tamsin stand and left to centre stage at our workstation. It would be white and have a soft focus of 60%. This would focus the audience's attention onto them, highlighting the tension. So the rest of the stage would be dark. Now that we've taken one quote and looked at how it can be used to answer all the questions in a past paper, let's take question 1 of the paper and change it so that it becomes an acting question and look at how we answer this, how the message is used to communicate to an audience, and how as an actor you would do this. Firstly, here's an example of an introductory paragraph. It helps the marker tell them about the play and what the message of the play is. So it tells them how I'm going to answer the question. For my first paragraph, I'm using the quote that we've already used. I don't want to be worrying about this all day, but changed it for an acting question. My description is therefore the same as the previous questions. In my explanation, it's the same as the directing question for question 1, but using the language of the question, the message. And in the last part of my analysis, is again the same as question 1. For paragraph B, again, I'm using the same as question 1, but changing it to being as an actor instead of a director. So in my description, I've changed it to being in first person, I would, I will. In my explanation, I've said how this communicates the message of the play using the language of the play. And for my analysis, it's exactly the same as the first question. Now we move on to using new quotes. For my second quote, I'm using, "It'll look like I've slacked off for 5 minutes." In my description, I've described what's going on when she says this, but also thinking about the message as well, so that it makes my explanation clear. In my explanation, I've explained how it communicates the message in saying that the establishment is big business at this moment and what the impact on Luke is. For my analysis, to get the development mark, I've linked it to the theme of workplace conditions and linking it back to the question about the message of the play. For paragraph B, I've given a description of my voice and movement as an actor when this line is said. I've given 3 voice terms and 3 movement terms. In my explanation, I've clearly said what this will show the audience, linking it to the message of the play using the language of the question. In the analysis, I've linked this to foreshadowing what happens later in the play, because I think it's easier with this quote to do that rather than social conditions. But again, I've brought it back to the question at the end. For my third point, I'm using the quote, "You have no idea how much I want to leave you to it sometimes." In this scene, there are other quotes that we know and could use, but I've used this one because I think it's easier to answer the question about the message than some of the other quotes. In the first part of the answer, I've described what's happening that leads up to Tamsin saying this. In the explanation, I've said how this communicates the message of the play and the impact it has on Dean. In my analysis, I've said what the audience will understand, and I've linked it to the theme of family commitment because of the emotional impact he has on her, and bringing it back to the question using the language of the question. Of paragraph B, in my explanation, I've given a description of my voice and movement, giving 3 voice terms and 3 movement terms. In the explanation, I've explained what the audience will understand and how it answers the question about communicating the message. In my analysis, I've linked it to the social conditions, how much they're struggling financially, and how that communicates the message of the play, and again, using the language of the question. In the fourth point, I'm using the quote, "How do I get what I want?" when Tamsin and Luke are outside the pub. I start by describing what's happening at this moment when Tamsin says the line. In explaining how this communicates the message, I'm saying that Tamsin's needs aren't being met because she's having to look after Dean. And in the analysis, I'm linking it to the theme of dreams and aspirations, because Luke is trying to achieve his aspirations, but Tamsin doesn't know how she will get hers. Then linking it back to the question about the message. For the B paragraph, again, I'm giving a description of my voice and movement when this line's said, giving 3 voice and 3 movement terms. In explaining, I've explained what the audience will see and linking it to the message of the play. In analysing, I've linked it to foreshadowing the end of the play and how this reinforces the message of the play, so that I'm using the language of the question. For my last point, I'm going to take a quote from our key moment 5, where Tamsin is questioned about her targets, because I think it's easier to link the message to this quote than from a quote in the last scene. I'm using the quote, we're already covered for tomorrow, I'm afraid. So in the first part of my answer, I've described what is happening when the lead says this. My explanation of how this answers the message of the play is about the problems of 0 hours contracts, and in the analysis, I'm linking it to the theme of workplace conditions, which helps to communicate the message of the play. In the B paragraph, I'm talking about movement only, since it's the lead that says this line. Because I'm only describing movement, I need to give a detailed description of what Tamsin would be doing. In my explanation, I'm saying what the audience will understand from this movement and how it communicates the message. In my analysis, I've linked it to social conditions in 0 hours contracts. Because I've already said that they're unfair, I can't say that again, so I've had to say that they should be banned. So you need to be careful that you're not repeating yourself, because you won't get the marks. Hopefully going through these questions has helped you to follow the structure of how the essays are to be written, what to include and what to change information from question to question.